So welcome everybody. I'm Alan Bookbinder, the Master of the College, and welcome to our alumni, friends and fellows who are joining us for this webinar. It's part of our much disrupted programme of activities to mark 40 years of women at Downing. And of course, this event is taking place in the same week as International Women's Day. We're going to have what I hope will be a very insightful discussion with our four panelists for about the first 40 minutes of the session. And then we'll take questions, some of which have been submitted in advance, but others, please submit them via the Q&A channel on your screens. And that will be for the final 20 minutes of the session. I should say that the event is being recorded and will be available on the Downing YouTube channel shortly after we have finished. Now, our panel today, we have four distinguished alumni of the college. Victoria Brignell has worked for the BBC for 20 years. She's currently a producer on Radio 4's In Our Time with Melvyn Bragg, which I noticed just this week has had its 900th episode. Victoria's an honorary fellow of the college and a disability champion in several arenas. Farmida is chair of the law firm Norton Rose Fulbright's EMEA division. Among her areas of expertise is Islamic finance, and she has a particular interest in sustainability and diversity and inclusion. Dharshini David is senior correspondent for economics and trade at the BBC, and much of the past year she's spent reporting on the economic impact of the pandemic. She's previously been an economist for the government and for HSBC Investment Bank. Henrietta Royle has occupied several senior roles, both in banks and in business schools. She was chief exec of the British Bankers Association and is now chief exec of Operis, specialists in project finance. She's also a founding member of the 30% Club, which campaigns for gender balance in corporate boards. Now, COVID has been bad news in many ways, but it's been particularly bad for equality. You'll know that BME people have been disproportionately victims of the pandemic. Disabled people have been far more likely to catch it and to die from it than everyone else. Women more likely to be furloughed, more likely to be anxious, depressed, lonely, spending far more time than men on unpaid childcare and housework. So I wanted to start by asking Dharshini, has equality been a casualty of the pandemic?
Master, thank you. A huge privilege to be back with you speaking at another Downing event. And I know, when we've spoken in the past at some events, it's been a very different picture. If we talked a year ago, it'll be an incredibly different picture. And when we talk about equality and the pandemic, clearly there's the health impact, as you've just outlined, with some groups being disproportionately hard hit in very tragic ways. And then there's the economic impact, and that too hasn't been equal by any means, and you referred to it there. You always know you're in trouble as an economics journalist when PRs start adopting a new tag or a new phrase. And just recently, I've noticed the term she-session popping up in emails and reports. And to my mind, quite frankly, it's one of those phrases that needs to be filed alongside mompreneur and the rest of those, because it sort of trivializes something that is actually quite serious. But what we have seen over the last year is the economic impact of this being felt in such a way that, yes, the clock is being dialed back on equality in all sorts of ways. And when you look at those who have lost their jobs, yes, they are disproportionately female, they're disproportionately young and lower paid. So we're seeing all sorts of inequalities opening up there, and that's because of the sectors that they're involved in, hospitality, retail. Those are the kind of sectors that have been hardest hit. Those who haven't lost their jobs, well, they may have been furloughed, which has been a lifeline to many who have got caring responsibilities, for example. But it's a double-edged sword, because you are effectively paying people to stay indoors. And we know that if you're staying indoors, if you're forced to stay indoors, for example, if you're more elderly, if you're shielding, you're living with disabilities, you are disadvantaged in the sense that you are not able to be in the workplace. If you are someone who's being furloughed because you're looking after children, well, what do we know from past studies? The longer career break you take from the workplace, the harder it is to get back into the workplace and get back on track. So we've seen those sort of disadvantages. Many people will be aware of that ad that the government had to pull about stay at home, which showed women doing the housework, doing the cooking, and then snuggling up with her husband on the sofa at the end of the day. So I'm not sure, there's something seemed to have popped up my, sorry, I think it's some speech, very 2021, voice activated software there. So we know that, there is that, that sort of emphasis, but that advert, even though it was pulled, brought up a very important point, and that is that we know that the roles at home are still not equal, that women are still more likely to take on more responsibilities in the home, and that's holding back equality. And there's a third aspect to this as well, in that sense that the spotlight has been taken away. And we look at the progress that's been made in recent years with, for example, policies such as gender pay gap reporting. Now that was suspended. It's going to be resumed later this year. But while that has gone, that's taken away some of the spotlight of progression. And it does mean that even though home working, for example, has been a bonus to many women in particular, it means that there are more at risk, we know, of being sidelined, of being denied progression. And that's what I found in my job when I interview women up and down the country. So in short, there's a lot of work to do. Now, there are signs of hope. We do see the government stepping up and admitting, and I've had conversations with number 11 and number 10 about this, admitting that there is a problem here and we need to address it. But the clock's ticking, because we know that unemployment is going to get a lot higher once the furlough scheme disappears altogether. And the big question is job creation going to be there for women? Can we get them back on the career path?
Thank you, thank you. Farmida, do you think this is a short-term setback, or are we going to see sort of long-term damaging effects on equality from the pandemic?
Thank you, Martin, and hello, everyone. I think both you and Dharshini have talked about the overall picture and the way that COVID has shone a light on gender inequality in the way that it has on other kinds of inequalities, and the focus on the invisible work that women have to do, particularly when schools are closed. I think I'm going to focus on the world that I know well, rather than the broad overviews that Dharshini has given about the position of women generally in the country. But what I'm seeing in my firm and in sort of my world in financial services is that women are having to cope with all of that. They're having to cope with, managing the home, dealing with school children, but work for people like us who are extremely fortunate hasn't slowed down. And our working days are longer, and our client demands are as sort of strong as ever. And that means that there is an almost intolerable pressure being placed on women, especially those with young children. Now, is that all going to magically disappear when the pandemic disappears? I'm not sure. I think it's really hard to tell, but I think the one thing that's very clear is that we're not going to be working in the same way going forward. We're mostly going to be working in some hybrid form where there's a combination of working from home and working in the office. And while that's a plus in some ways, because it was always very hard for women to persuade employers to let them work from home traditionally, and that isn't going to be an issue going forward, my worry is that if the days that you're working from home are anything like the days they've been while we're in the pandemic, that is not going to be sustainable. So if you don't have some combination of core working hours, then the pressure on mental health and burnout is going to be immense. So I was just thinking before coming onto this call about my day on Tuesday. On Tuesday, I started a client call at 7:30 in the morning because I was speaking to clients in Kuala Lumpur. And then I finished at 11 p.m. because I had sort of an internal firm call with colleagues in Texas. And, you know, that is not, yesterday wasn't quite that bad, but that's not an unusual day. And you have to do that because, you know, where else are you going to be? You're at home, you're available, and you can be on those calls. So I think that way of working going forward is not going to be good for women. I'm also concerned that women working from home will focus on families when they're not doing their core work. They're not going to be writing the articles or doing the stuff that helps them to progress in their jobs in the way that perhaps their male colleagues will do. And not being in the office will mean that they're missing out on informal links and the sort of social contacts that allow them to progress. So the hybrid working model, which seems desirable in some ways, I fear could be a negative for women. And then Dharshini referred to a recession, which is not a word I can say or like much and haven't come across before. But I am really worried that if that much anticipated economic downturn that we all fear happens, the focus on diversity will disappear. I think we saw that after the global financial crisis for maybe 3 or 4 years. The progress that we have made was parked because diversity is actually nice to have. If businesses are focusing on survival, then some of the emphasis that we've had around all forms of diversity, I think will have to take a back seat. And so that is why it's important for businesses to maintain targets and transparency. So whether that's publishing the gender pay gap or having objective criteria around promotions, it is going to be really important that we keep those things going through the crisis, which I suspect will come once we're over the worst of this health crisis.
Thank you. Victoria, I mentioned that disabled people have suffered disproportionately from COVID. And I wondered how damaging do you think the pandemic has been for disability rights and the position of disabled people?
There's no doubt that the pandemic has hit disabled people incredibly hard. A few stats for you. The ONS says that about 60% of COVID-related deaths are disabled people. People with learning difficulties have been particularly at risk. If you've got learning disability, you're 70% more likely to die than other people. Research by Public Health England has shown that young people with learning difficulties have a death rate that's 30 times higher than for other people. That's for people aged between 18 and 24. So the death rates amongst disabled people are really tragic. What's been particularly disturbing, though, is the behaviour of some doctors. Now, I want to emphasise that most doctors are absolutely wonderful people, but there are some doctors who make judgments about disabled people's lives, about the value of their lives, who make assumptions that disabled people have a low quality of life and therefore assume that disabled people are not worth saving. And there have been instances documented by disability charities of disabled people getting calls and letters from doctors asking them to put do not resuscitate orders on their medical notes, and asking them to sign forms, agree not to call emergency services if their situation, if their condition worsens. Disability groups became so concerned about this that about 160 groups got together and issued a joint statement calling on the NHS to uphold disabled people's rights and to ensure disabled people got the same access to treatment for COVID as other people. Fortunately, the Chief Medical Officer at the NHS responded, and he also issued a statement saying the NHS would protect disabled people's rights and that would take place throughout the pandemic. And the Health Secretary also made a statement saying that the blanket application of do not necessitate orders was totally unacceptable and must not happen. That provides some reassurance, but still people have to be alert still. When doctors are under pressure, under stress, when they're treating more patients than normal, when equipment and beds are limited, in those conditions, the potential for discrimination against disabled people is high. Another area of concern is the Coronavirus Act, the emergency legislation that was brought in at the start of the pandemic. This gave sweeping powers to local authorities and the government to suspend some rights of disabled people. So, for example, it gives local authorities effectively the ability to reduce disabled people's assistance regardless of their need. And to date, about 10 local authorities have taken advantage of this power officially. And there are reports of other local authorities reducing and restricting essential services for disabled people. And the government argues that the Act is necessary to give local authorities flexibility to respond effectively to the pandemic and to save lives. But disability groups want to make sure that when the pandemic is over, those rights are then restored to disabled people. And also disabled people face various practical issues. So, for example, in some parts of the country, disabled people have had difficulty getting hold of PPE. So we're being told to shield, but they're not given the equipment we need to shield effectively. Some disabled people have found their assistants disappearing because they are self-isolating or off sick. Some people have had difficulty getting food supplies because supermarkets won't give them priority delivery slots. The picture has been quite dark for disabled people. The message of the government is stay at home, but people have to understand that for disabled people, home isn't necessarily safe. If you haven't got the right PPE equipment, if you haven't got the right personal assistance, if you can't get hold of regular food supplies, then you're not safe. And disabled people, disability groups, feel that not enough has been done to minimise the risks to disabled people.
Thank you. So far, it's a rather gloomy picture emerging. I wondered, Henrietta, whether there is possibly a brighter bit of news. Recent report that the proportion of women on boards and senior management is increasing considerably. And this is something I know you put a lot of work into as one of the founders of 30% Club. Is there room for optimism there?
Well, there's always room for optimism because it is good that there has been some progression, but it took us longer than we hoped to even get to 30%. I think we originally aimed for 30% by 2015. I think it took us to about 2018 to get there. There are now no longer any FTSE 350 boards without women on them. And there is a very high proportion of boards, which, particularly in the FTSE 100, which are at 30% or over. But, there are a lot of boards with only one woman. They've got their token woman and they go, phew, we've done that, tick that box, move on. In addition, the challenges of filling the pipeline, which actually means having more women on executive committees, that's still a real challenge for us, we see. And that really requires for firms not doing what Farmida worried that they might do, which is taking their eye off the ball in terms of looking for talented women to hire and then making sure they progress those through the organization in the way that they should be. And, one obviously is concerned that may be the case, that people say, oh, well, it's too difficult. My view is that if things are difficult, you need your best talent, and therefore you need to be more focused on making sure that you're not wasting it and that you're not neglecting your half of your best talent, which is your female talent. We have actually, for us, the really good benefit of the flexible furlough that the government has brought in is that we've really made an effort to make sure that we share it around. So there have been periods where things have been a bit slow and we've used furlough. But what we've done is rotate people through it. So nobody goes on furlough and then sits there. They're on furlough for a few days and then somebody else takes over. And we've been very conscious to make sure that we don't have a situation where male or female staff find themselves sort of stuck on furlough for, you know, the longest period that we're ever going to put somebody on furlough for. But it is noticeable that our female staff, when I'm on Zoom calls, I don't see small children trotting into the room and poking at mummy's shoulder to try and get her attention when she's busy in a meeting, doing that to their fathers. I don't know whether they lock their doors more efficiently or what they do, but it just doesn't seem to happen in the same way. Though I know there are one or two of my male colleagues who have had challenges, and indeed one formally asked himself to be put on furlough so that he could deal with some childcare challenges, because having the nurseries closed, having the schools closed, that's been the biggest problem, because you can't, it's all very well working from home, but you need childcare, because you can't work from work and do childcare, even if you're in the same, you know, or sitting in the same building. And what's been crucial is the opening of the nurseries and the schools, particularly for women, because they are tending still to do the majority of the childcare.
And the thing one hears about is this notion of the double shift, of the woman who does a shift at work and then a shift at home as a mother or carer. And I wonder whether that that has got worse when people are in lockdown and doing, as you described, Farmida, you know, long shifts on Zoom, video conferencing, etc., but also have then homeschooling and childcare. I don't know what any of you may have noticed of that.
I think the problem there is not so much a double shift as a concurrent shift. Is that it's not a question of working through the day and then suddenly you start doing children in the evening. Children have gone to bed by then. What the problem is that they're having to feed their children, homeschool their children somehow, keep them amused whilst actually working. And that's an incredible challenge. And more women, particularly the younger the children are, the more the sort of, I think there is an expectation by themselves, by society, by the children, that somehow mummy is the first port of call.
Exactly, the double shift has always been there. So
yeah.
You've always had to go to work and look after all the domestic side of life. I think what the pandemic has done is sort of make that invisible work visible to everybody. So if you're on a call, and as I've found with female colleagues, they have a little child sitting next to them who's colouring in and trying not to interrupt. That's not something that can be hidden from anybody. And so, as Henrietta said, the really difficult thing has been homeschooling, especially younger children, at the same time as doing work. But the reality for many working women has been that they've had to do the same work as their male colleagues, and then worry about, you know, when the plumber is going to come in and when it's a National Book Day, so they've got to sort out a costume for their child. And you know, all of those things have been a part of many working mothers' lives for a long time. And you know, I think for quite a lot of working fathers, it's really the first time it's been visible to them. I think in the past they've been able to close the door, go to work, and sort of all those things happen by magic. And now they can all see that that stuff doesn't happen by magic. It happens because somebody is putting in time and effort.
I just want to say one thing on schools. I think I have to rethink how they approach dealing what they do, because it seems noticeable to me, talking to my colleagues who've got younger children and to friends who've got younger children. The assumption is that somehow there is a non-working wife there. What are they doing with these days where apparently you're supposed to come in some child in some wonderful costume, or you're supposed to bake these things? That why the hell is anybody doing that? Why is there this expectation? Because it always seems to fall on the mother, and it is a ludicrous thing that you're sitting there. I can't remember, wasn't there a program where they had that joke that the mother in the end bought some mince pies from M&S or something, and then bashed them gently on the top to make them look like they'd been homemade. Why is that even happening?
It's changing. Sorry, Farmida.
Not really.
I was just, the point I was going to make on that is, I was massively told off by one of my sons who said that the dad of a friend of his comes along to everything, and I don't, and his dad has a very serious job. And I had to say to him that when the dad announces to the office that he's off to see his son play football, everybody looks terribly pleased and says, what a wonderful man. If I were to say, I'm taking the afternoon off to see my son play football, people would say, you've got a job to do, why aren't you getting on with a day job? And that sort of double thing is still there. And I know it's changing, but it's not that different. Men will still have lots of pictures of their children in the office, and women probably won't.
I think you're absolutely.
Victoria, did you want to speak?
Yeah, I just to reiterate what's been said, really, that there was a very interesting study by the University of Sussex a little while ago about the effect of the pandemic on mothers, and it showed that the proportion of mothers who said they were responsible for 90% or more of childcare had gone up from about 25% to 45%, and about 7 in 10 mothers said they were completely or almost completely responsible for all homeschooling. So it seems that as women lose their jobs more, we're doing less paid work, but doing more of the domestic labour.
Back to the 1950s, in effect, which I think has been a real worry and something we have to grasp. I mean, it's really interesting, and I think you're absolutely right. And there's a completely different level of adulation almost men get when they say they're going to do something in the domestic sphere by wider society. I interviewed the head of Mumsnet recently about this, and I said, okay, I'm sitting here talking to you because my other half's making dinner at the moment. She said, yes. She said, that's all great, but ultimately women are responsible for the project management of a household. And it is all those sort of bigger stuff. And I think a lot of this has got to do with the institutions around us. And you mentioned schools there. I find it very irritating that both our names are on school contact forms, but 9 times out of 10, I'll get the phone call or the email when my husband might be able to respond quicker. So I think our institutions have got to change. And I also think that it's the real catalyst at the moment, perhaps, for change. Now, we're having calls for the first time I've ever known that childcare should be treated as infrastructure investment by the government, for example, in the same way that we do roads and railways, because it gets a lot of us to work and keeps us there. The question is whether or not it's going to make any difference at the end of the day.
There's always been a strong argument that actually childcare, if you can deduct the cost of a secretary if you're working, how come that's okay but not childcare, which is absolutely fundamental? And if you have to employ somebody, or they go to a childminder, whether you've got a nanny or a childminder or a nursery, you should, I think, actually should be able to put that against tax. And it's an absolute fundamental thing about being able to work, and men need to, one of the key things that one person said to me a long time ago is the most important thing when you're thinking about your career as a woman is thinking about who you're going to marry, what his attitude is going to be. Does he see childcare as a joint project and family as a joint project? Is it really yours? The idea, well, an MBA is an investment, a nanny isn't. You should pay for that out of your own, what the woman earns. But if she doesn't, she's not going to actually make a profit on it, as it were, and have a surplus. Well, what's the point? She might as well give up. No, it's an investment in your career.
We've spent a lot of time talking about children, haven't we? And so I guess one question that it's worth asking is there gender equality if you take children out of the equation? So for a woman who doesn't have childcare responsibilities, is she able to achieve equality in the workplace? I mean, my sort of sense over the last 30 years is that it's probably much easier, but it's not equal.
No,
women without children.
I think.
Sorry.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think what the pandemic has shown is that it's highlighted the fact that if we want to achieve equality for women, we need to see a transformation in men's lives. I mean, there was a report by the Parliamentary Women and Equalities Committee 3 years ago, which showed that men who ask for flexible working or parental leave often face discrimination. And I think what the pandemic is doing is it's giving us an opportunity to rethink how we structure family life and working life. I think, for example, we need to get to a point where work is shared more equally between men and women. So, for example, at the moment, only 1 in 8 men work part-time, but I think about 50% of women do, or 40%. So, I mean, what we need to do is actually incentivize couples for men to work less and women to work more. So, in one suggestion I've seen is that we should maybe change the tax system so that the last 20% of your earnings you tax at a higher rate, and we encourage more couples to work 4-day weeks each. I mean, if you look at the figures, the average working week at the moment is 32 hours, so we're almost at 4 days a week already. But what's happening is that men work full time and women tend to work part time. Whereas what we ought to do, move to a situation where both mothers and fathers work 4 days a week, and that will give men more chance to spend time with their children. And I think if you speak to most fathers, they want to spend more time with their children. And I think what society needs to do is to bring about a situation where both men and women have the right to be equal parents, to be full parents.
And there's a real conundrum here. I mean, there's a real conundrum here because there's been various studies done on this which show that even when you have women earning more than their partners pre-children, when children arrive, it's more likely to be the woman that gives up work or cuts down their hours. So the question is how, as you say, if you're going to use the tax system to try and incentivize men to take that load, if you will, into cutting hours, how do we do this? And quite frankly, is part-time working always the answer? I mean, I know quite a few women who actually say, well, look, I've always worked 4 days a week. Well, I've had kids, but quite a few women I know say, well, I get paid for 3 or 4 days, but the job actually fills 4 or 5 days. So ultimately, who's winning here? And I feel like I need to put in the extra time to show that I'm actually serious and that I'm on the progression track rather than actually discarded or sidelined.
Well, I think that some of the young are somewhat different, and we certainly at Operis see it as a good attractor that we provide flexibility, and indeed, interestingly, see some of the men taking it up. So I can't think of any of our men who've recently had a baby who hasn't taken their parental leave. It's just always happened. Actually, before the pandemic, we had a man who was coming back with his girlfriend to the UK, having been headed up our Canadian office, who said the deal is that she wants to live with her parents, wants us to live with her parents where her parents live in Northern Ireland. I can't commute from Northern Ireland. Can I do 3 days a week, 2-3 days a week in the office and work from home the rest of the time? And we said yes. And we've just demonstrated through COVID that it's really easy for everybody to do that. So we are actually encouraging and trying to get a sense of, I would love to be able to afford to give men the same amount of parental leave as women does. And Aviva did that, about 2 years ago. And I would like to see, I think it'd be healthy for our workforces, male and female, if we did that. And it would put them then on an equal basis. But there's got to be a culture within the firm that the men feel comfortable taking it up, that they don't see themselves, oh, well, yes, we've got it theoretically, but you're going to be looked at very oddly if you actually take it up. You aren't at Operis. And whereas STEM and financy and financial services as it gets.
We talked a little bit about what was visible and what wasn't visible. And one of the less visible aspects of the pandemic, and a really rather dark one, is the increase in domestic violence. In lockdown, women appear to be under greater danger of physical attack from their male partner. And I wondered what reflections you might have on that.
think you're quite right that the pandemic has highlighted this problem in our society, and domestic abuse charities have seen a huge rise in the number of phone calls from women asking for help. The domestic abuse is a social issue that's been going on for an awful long time, and in some ways it's good the pandemic has thrown a spotlight on it, because it is becoming much more of an issue that people are talking about now, and when something's being talked about, then there is pressure for change. I mean, the various charities like Save Lives are doing tremendous work to try and support women in that situation, and there are changes going through Parliament at the moment, which hopefully will help women in that predicament.
I think what we've got to remember is that there are an awful lot of people. Many of us are very lucky. We've had jobs which, we've been able to work from home. They're secure. We're reasonably well paid. We live in nice houses, probably with outside space and gardens, even if we are in London. There are an awful lot of people who live in very, very tiny flats with no outside space, who are financially precarious and have become more financially precarious since COVID hit, and who've got tiny children at home in a very small space. And stress levels are bound to rise under that scenario. And particularly if there's problems, there were problems maybe beforehand, which now have been exacerbated by being close to things. Some people are going to take it out on somebody who's close at hand to do it. And it is terrifying, because it's much more difficult for somebody to escape from that situation, to find help, whether for the children or for themselves or both. And
lockdown happened overnight.
The pandemic, there were not enough refuges, women's refuges. And the government needs to put more money into that side of things, I think.
I mean, the lockdown happened overnight, didn't it? And it's taken time for us to realise that we haven't known what's been happening behind those closed doors. I think it's been quite telling that I'm a governor at a local school, and in the first lockdown, there was hardly any kids, key workers, kids actually attending. This time around, the numbers have soared, and it's largely because they know more about what's been happening behind closed doors, and where there are children in particular who have been seeing the fallout of the stresses and the vulnerabilities and some of the dysfunction. But you do wonder what happened that first time round, and how many lives were basically put on hold. And I think it's shone a light in all sorts of areas, and it's domestic violence is one of those awful ones. I'm also worried in some of the ways that other groups are falling behind, for example, children with SEND, for example. And we know there's attainment gaps we made up, particularly of a lot of children in a lot of underprivileged homes. But for a lot of children who have got special needs and educational needs, they're going to have a massive gap to fill up. And again, this is something we're only slowly discovering that the provision before wasn't enough. And how on earth do we go about building things up once this pandemic, hopefully, we see the light at the end of the tunnel.
So it's very easy to think that everything before the pandemic was fine, and everything during the pandemic has been bad. Actually, it's much more complex than that. For example, in the field of disability rights, even before the pandemic, there is evidence that disabled people's lives were very difficult. In 2017, the UN mounted an investigation into the situation of disabled people in the UK, and the extent to which the UK was meeting its commitments under the UN Convention on Disabled People's Rights. And it found that there was, quote, serious violations, grave violations. Some were grave, some were systemic, and some were both. And in 2018, the Equality and Human Rights Commission published a progress report on disability rights, and said that across the UK, there'd been regressions in disabled people's rights, and social protections were being reduced. So it's similarly with the domestic abuse. We are now trying to address these issues. And I think, as I say, that the pandemic gives us an opportunity to actually improve society for the better.
Thank you. So I'm going to move on to some of the comments and questions in the chat. We've had several people very much empathizing with your various descriptions of what women face. One person says, it has been very tough for me. I'm my own boss, founder of my law firm, but my son has autism and requires a lot of my time. I've had very long days. So she can very much relate, certainly, to what you were saying, Farmida. Another person asks, to what extent is the problem that those of us who are older have assumed the role of being in charge of the house and children? The younger generations seem to share the role more, which could be seen as real progress. But is that something that you are noticing, that a younger generation, particularly younger men, are prepared to share more childcare, housework, etc.? Is that a trend that you recognise?
Certainly.
Yes,
Absolutely.
across the board, but not equally, generally speaking. So the point that I think Henrietta made about parental leave, I think people do share jobs. They sort of share the day-to-day work, but it's still women who take a huge amount of parental leave, and the men don't. So to that extent, in terms of the structural impact on career development, it still falls disproportionately on women. But in terms of the day-to-day, I think younger men are willing to do much more.
I think it's more even, talking to my younger colleagues, it's quite interesting that the men have said, well, yes, we're doing more, but they've admitted they're nowhere near 50-50.
Yeah, I think we've got a way to go. I think. I mean, certainly, I've noticed that colleagues, younger colleagues, and particularly dads of young children, and particularly during the pandemic, have been taking up the reins quite a lot. And I work with quite a few who've been doing exactly that, and have been admirably working, juggling work and homeschooling, and putting the laundry on, cooking lunch while doing everything else. But I think we've got a long way to go. And we were watching the Meghan and Harry interview the other night, and it fell to my husband to actually point out his amusement that ITV was showing a load of ads about doing the laundry and cleaning the house, and it tended to be women doing all those tasks rather than men. So I think things are changing in the generations, but perhaps in terms of our institutions, we've got some catching up to do.
Research has shown that, that if men have a temporary period doing a lot of childcare, it can have a lasting effect on their attitudes, and over the long term, they will then do more childcare later in life. I think maybe we could learn from Iceland, where all men are entitled to take 3 months statutory paternity leave in the first year of their child's life, and they don't take it, they lose it, and there's very, very high take up of it as a result, and it's paid at a very high level. And yeah, I think if we introduce something similar in this country, we could find that men, when their children get older, also do more of the childcare.
On the point of father's involvement, one contributor, a man, says fathers are juggling an awful lot too, compounded if their wives also work and the children are not in school and or home childcare is not available. He says, aren't you compounding the inequality debate by focusing so heavily on the role of mothers rather than the role of parents?
This is the point I was making earlier, that if we are to achieve gender equality, then we need to see fundamental changes in men's lives as well as women's lives, and it's in men's interests for this to happen, so they can spend an equal amount of time with their children as women do.
But it really does require that societal change to be, not to see a man doing this stuff as, oh, isn't he marvelous, he's helping, as opposed to, well, this is perfectly normal and expected, which makes it easier, I think, and there's society gives space for men and assumes men will do it, which I think makes it easier for them to do it, rather than, well, this is an added extra, and actually in terms of your career, what are you doing?
I mean, we certainly know that the gulf really opens up when women have children, and that's, you know, unfortunately an undeniable fact. And yes, society is changing, you know, and I'm afraid to say that, you know, an increasing number of men I know who are, you know, finding themselves trying to take on more flexible careers are suddenly realizing to their shock that that means that they haven't got perhaps the path that they imagined they would do, and that it has held them back. But I think we are a way off from being at that point where men and women, when they are parents, are having the same experiences in the workplace. I mean, don't forget, a year ago, it was illegal, I mean, it still is illegal, to ask a woman if she has children. And it's happened to me in the past as well, in an interview. You know, it's illegal. But now, frankly, if you are a woman and you're looking for a job, people can see it. And unfortunately, we know from studies that some bosses do make assumptions when they are conscious that a woman has got caring responsibilities about their commitment to a role. So there are still things to iron out.
And also, actually, now I think about it, the only two people who have gone part-time, one 4 days a week and one 3 days a week, are two of our senior women. None of the senior men have asked for that.
So if you look at it from an employer's perspective, and you look at how long people's working lives are, their children's needs are relatively short, especially when they're young and their needs are intensive, are for a short period of your working life. And I hope that some of this is to do with confidence, and whether it's a father or a mother that's taking on those responsibilities when the children are young. You know, you learn so much by doing that, and you have so much more of your career to go when the children get older, that you should be able to pick up at that point and get back to have some time off while they're young, and then sort of carry on the trajectory that you were on at the beginning. This idea that you're doing fantastically, you get to the point where you decide to have children, and then your career just effectively ends. That doesn't reflect modern society, when we're all expected to work until we're 70. It seems quite an old-fashioned way of thinking, and society does need to move on as far as that's concerned as well.
But Farmida, the interesting thing though is, if you look at law and you look at banking and you look at many of these places, the expectation is that you will have to go portfolio in your mid-50s, early 60s. You're effectively maneuvered out in order to let the 40-year-olds come up, and that's ridiculous. Why is that still happening? As you say, we're all living longer, we have to work longer, but yet that the threshold for when you have to go, you stop working full time, the pressure is still there at the same age.
I think there's also, there's a fundamental issue here in that we're living in a society which doesn't give enough value to caring, doesn't give care enough priority. I mean, we can see this when we look at the amount that people are paid. For example, care workers are paid, disgracefully low amounts. I'd love to pay my carers more, but my funding is limited by the local authority, and the local authority's funding is limited. So we need to reassess our priorities and attach a proper value to caring, where it's caring done by parents or by paid support staff.
There's a lot of interest in the chat in possible economic ways forward. Interest in taxing the top 20% of people's time, making nursery tax deductible. And two people raised the question of universal basic income, and whether furlough demonstrates that the economy could withstand a universal basic income, and that this might help reduce some of the underlying problems we're talking about. Dharshini, you might have a thought on that.
It's an intriguing idea, which as people are saying, has been discussed more and more as we look at the example of furlough, when we've effectively been paying people not to work, and saying, is this a way forward? And talking to the DWP and saying to them, well, this has worked. Surely and they say no, because the emphasis, politically or otherwise, is on a welfare system which supports people who can't work and incentivizes people who can to get back into work and support them doing that. And there are obviously rights and wrongs to that. On top of that, of course, there is this issue of the bill. And we have seen the government shelling out probably in excess of £400 billion in total in terms of trying to underpin the economy and counter the health effects of this pandemic. And I simply don't think there is the will or the the financial bravery to do that, put it that way.
I would agree. It's interesting that various people have tried it in various places and nobody's gone on with it, really.
I think there are going to be different ways of working going forward, and whether that's shorter hours for everybody, a 4-day week, some kind of combination which allows you to balance all the different things in your life. And I hope we work towards that. And the current model of everybody doing very long days and then having to fit in the rest of their life around that. Perhaps the last 12 months have shown us that it doesn't have to be that way, that we need to step back and have a think about this approach that we've had for so long, where certainly 2 people in a family need to work incredibly long hours just to have enough money to keep the family surviving. It's not a very sustainable way of continuing. And we've seen the effect of people who don't think they're benefiting from the current economic environment. It's not cohesive.
On a different subject, one of our students asks, to pick up on the mention of the media, what do you think are the largest influencers or reinforcers of stereotypical gender norms? Is this something where we can blame the media, or is it broader?
I think the media does play a part in this, and it's an ongoing discussion. I mean, I mentioned advertising, and I think we've got a long way to go in terms of some of the stereotypes that are perpetuated there. But again, the makeup of that industry is changing rapidly as well. So hopefully the thinking will change over time. And I think also, to be quite honest, in the news arena, we've got a lot to basically think about as well, because there's a task force that's being set up, a G7 gender equality task force, which is being set up by the UK to try to drive forward an agenda about how we think about the pandemic leading to greater equality. And it's going to be chaired by a former editor of mine, Sarah Sands, who was at the helm of the Today programme until last year. And one of the reasons why I started working with her is because she had a big push that we think about women's roles in a different way. Like, for example, she looked at London Fashion Week and said, why do we treat this as a bit of fun and frivolity, when this is an industry that supports the livelihoods of millions of women, and in fact is as valuable as the car industry. We should stop thinking about business as being hard hats and high-vis jackets and start thinking about it in a different way. So I think, there is a lot to be done to overturn some established ways of thinking. And the media does play a role in that.
Well, you could see with the fashion industry that government doesn't take it seriously at all, and they're just being flippant about the difficulties that people have got in terms of getting the effects of Brexit, haven't they? It's been very damaging to that industry, and oh poof, it's a few models and get over it, sort of thing. And it's just ridiculous that you've got these sorts of attitudes. And perhaps but the good thing is, I think, in politics is that in the past, I think if a woman hadn't been, let's say, seen as a particularly successful minister or a particularly successful, prime minister, it would have been, oh, well, you see, women can't do it. And I'm not sure that's, well, it'd be interesting what you think, but I don't get the impression there is that reaction in quite that way anymore. There was incredible sexism over some people. I still think there is there, but it doesn't seem to be, oh, well, this particular female minister, we don't think she's very good, and therefore women aren't, which I think historically there was.
Yeah, I think there's a slightly different issue going on now, which is that, again, when I was doing that work with Mums Now on gender equality, a survey said that 3 out of 4 of their users feared that women's voices weren't heard at the top of government. And when I went to various government ministers and went, do you think the government has a woman problem? I was quite surprised by the number of them who would say, some of them on record, yes, we do. And we're just not hearing a broad enough, we're looking at things through very much a male lens. And we need to change that. But But, you know, awareness is the first step to the solution, right? So hopefully that means that we've got past that point where, as you say, women are judged purely on the basis of their gender, but perhaps we'll start looking at things in a slightly different way now.
I think some of it is role modeling as well. So I think as more women work and have families, it will be easier for the next generation to see that as the norm. I remember being quite struck when my children were young, having a friend from Brazil and another friend from India, both of whom were entirely comfortable with the fact that they were working mums because their own mothers had been working mums. They saw it as perfectly normal. And that sort of rather English angst about it just seemed completely bizarre to them. So I'm hopeful that going forward, as many more mothers are working, that is going to become the norm, and some of the stereotypes around the stay-at-home mother will just seem strange to them.
I think the media is getting more diverse as well, and will carry on getting more diverse. For example, the BBC has set targets of a workforce of 50% women, 20% BME background, and 12% from a disabled background. And as we see the media become more diverse, we'll see more diverse faces on screen and more diverse voices on the radio airwaves. And hopefully other media companies will follow the BBC's example and also carry on recruiting more people from diverse backgrounds.
With apologies to all the people whose questions and comments I haven't been able to pass on, I do have one final question on a slightly brighter note. Can you think of a moment when you've really felt equality in the room, whether for yourself or amongst all the people involved? Where were you? What was happening? Why did it feel so good? Anyone think of a moment when equality was really, really to the fore?
Well, I have to say, I do sort of feel that in my executive committee meetings, because we are 50-50. Well, we're not quite 50-50 male-female. We're one under on the female side, but come July, I think it is, we will then be 50-50. And I think everybody does treat each other as an individual, and everybody, I think, has got the same voice, I would like to think. So I like to think that the Operis executive committee is actually a place where there is.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, it's a really difficult one, isn't it? Because in some senses, I find it's a question of sheer numbers. And, you know, I'm so used to going to press conferences, you know, the Treasury or the Bank of England, and you look around and you suddenly realise you're the only woman there. But that's changing. And in the last time I interviewed the Governor of the Bank of England, there were 6 broadcasters there, 3 of us are women. And it was so nice to be in company and not feel like the only one there, because we used to bet in press conferences I'd be the first one to be picked on, even if I didn't have my hand up, because frankly everybody else there was a bloke and everybody on the stage was a bloke as well. So that's changed. But I think frankly, working in the media, I find it so refreshing now to pitch a story saying, can I do this about, you know, women and equality, particularly during the pandemic, and people don't roll their eyes anymore. And they go, yep, that's a mainstream story. It's not just a women's interest one. But yeah, I think we've got a long way to go though.
Farmida or Victoria, do you have a good news equality moment or episode?
You go first, Farmida.
Sorry, Victoria, you might want another minute or two to think about it, because I did. I can't think of a single sort of episode that I remember as a heartwarming example of equality in action. I'm sure there have been lots. I don't count diversity events as that, because, you know, then we're reflecting back on the issues. But I mean, I think generally speaking, things are getting better. You know, I used to walk into a room and be the only woman, and now I'm generally not the only woman, and that is progress. And I think some of it is about your personal attitude. If you walk into a room feeling comfortable being there, then that is something that communicates itself to other people, and hopefully it gets easier for the next woman who walks into the room. So I can't, unfortunately, think of a single example, but things are definitely getting better.
Yes. Anything that strikes you, Victoria?
It's difficult to think of a particular moment. I suppose for me, being a wheelchair user, I'm always excited when more buildings become accessible. And I go to the theatre a lot in normal times. And I've noticed in the time I've been living in London, more and more theatres getting access. And when I first moved to London, there were two major theatres that didn't have wheelchair access. And now they do. And I see that makes me very happy.
Good. Good. Well, it's nice to end on some bright thoughts. So we've come to the end of our time. Thank you to those attending. And again, I'm sorry I didn't get round to all your comments and questions, but they are visible to the panelists, and I'm sure they will take them to heart. And a special thank you, of course, to our panel for being so fluent and insightful. I think that was a conversation that really struck home. Thank you. So thank you, Farmida, Victoria, Henrietta, Dharshini, and thank you to all, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.